The sealed envelope trembled slightly in Dr. Phil's hands as he stood center stage, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something none of the studio audience had ever witnessed before: genuine shock. "Stop the cameras," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the studio silence like a blade. The red recording lights dimmed, crew members froze mid-motion, and 40 years of carefully buried secrets hung in the air, waiting to shatter two families forever. How did we get here? How did a routine DNA paternity test turn into the most emotionally charged moment in Dr. Phil's decades-long career? It started 3 weeks earlier when Margaret Chen, a 67-year-old retired teacher from Portland, wrote to the show with what seemed like a straightforward request. Her daughter Sarah, now 41, had been searching for her biological father since she turned 18. Margaret had been young, unmarried, and working as a hospital clerk when she became pregnant in 1982. The father was a medical resident who had promised to marry her but disappeared when she told him about the pregnancy. "I just want my daughter to have closure," Margaret had written in her letter. "She deserves to know where she comes from." Across the country in Atlanta, Dr. James Morrison, a 68-year-old cardiologist, was dealing with his own family crisis. His son Michael had been questioning their relationship for years, pointing out physical differences and feeling disconnected from the family legacy. James's wife of 45 years, Linda, had finally convinced him to appear on Dr. Phil to put the doubts to rest once and for all. Neither family knew the other existed when they agreed to appear on the show. The producers had scheduled them for the same episode purely by coincidence. Two separate DNA segments that would typically run back-to-back with clear, definitive results. But as Dr. Phil was about to discover, some secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried. The morning of filming, both families arrived at the studio with nervous energy. Margaret held Sarah's hand tightly as they were escorted to their dressing room. "Whatever happens today," she whispered, "I love you, and that's all that matters." 3 doors down, James Morrison paced restlessly while his wife Linda tried to calm their son Michael. "Dad, I'm not trying to hurt you," Michael said for the 100th time. "I just need to know the truth." Dr. Phil began the show with his trademark directness, addressing Margaret and Sarah first. "Margaret, you were 26 when you became pregnant. Tell me about Sarah's biological father." Margaret's voice shook as she recounted the story. "His name was Jim. He was a resident at Portland General. Dark hair, about 6 feet tall, very charming. He said he loved me, said we'd get married after his residency." She paused, tears forming. "When I told him I was pregnant, he said he needed time to think. I never saw him again." Dr. Phil nodded sympathetically, then turned to the camera. "We reached out to Portland General Hospital, and while they couldn't provide specific information due to privacy laws, we did confirm that a James Morrison completed his residency there in 1983. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." The audience murmured as Dr. Phil introduced the second family. James Morrison walked onto the stage with the confidence of a man who had spent decades saving lives, but something in his eyes flickered when he heard the name of his former hospital. "Dr. Morrison," Dr. Phil began, "your son Michael has requested this DNA test. But I have to ask, did you ever work at Portland General Hospital?" The color drained from James's face. Linda grabbed his arm, sensing something was wrong. Yes, I did my cardiology residency there. But what does that have to?" He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes met Margaret's across the stage. The recognition was instant and devastating. 40 years collapsed into a single moment of eye contact, and the secret that had shaped both their lives finally stood exposed under the studio lights. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. "Margaret?" James whispered, his voice barely audible through his microphone. "Jim," she replied, and the single word carried 4 decades of pain, anger, and unresolved love. Sarah looked between her mother and the stranger on stage, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Michael stared at his father, finally understanding why the DNA test had seemed so important to him. Dr. Phil, in 30 years of television, had never encountered a moment like this. 2 separate families, 2 different DNA requests, and a secret connection that no one, not even the producers, had seen coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Phil said, his voice unusually soft, "I need to stop this show." The audience sat in stunned silence as Dr. Phil addressed his crew. "Turn off the cameras. Get me the DNA results for both families immediately. And someone get our counseling team down here right now." But the cameras kept rolling. The producers knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would change not just these families but everyone watching. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. Instead of continuing with the planned format, he invited both families to come together center stage. Margaret and James stood face to face for the first time in 4 decades, while their children, who were about to discover they were half-siblings, watched in amazement. "James," Dr. Phil said quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know Margaret was pregnant when you left Portland?" James's composure cracked completely. "I knew," he whispered. "God help me, I knew. I was scared, I was young, and I made the worst decision of my life. I convinced myself she was better off without me." Linda Morrison's world shattered audibly. She had never known about Margaret, never known that her husband had abandoned a pregnant woman, never known that her son had a half-sister. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite her tears. "I raised Sarah alone for 26 years before I met my husband Tom. She graduated valedictorian, became a teacher, has 2 beautiful children. But she always wondered about you, James. She always wondered why her father didn't want her. But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming." Dr. Phil reached into his jacket and pulled out both DNA result envelopes. He looked at James, then at Margaret, then at Sarah and Michael, who were staring at each other with a mixture of wonder and recognition. "I'm going to open these results," Dr. Phil said. "But before I do, I want everyone to understand that we're not just revealing paternity today. We're reuniting a family that was torn apart by fear and bad choices 40 years ago." He opened James's envelope first. "Dr. James Morrison," he read, "you are not the biological father of Michael Morrison." Linda gasped. Michael closed his eyes in relief and vindication. But James barely reacted. He was staring at the second envelope in Dr. Phil's hands. "And Sarah Chen," Dr. Phil continued, opening the second envelope. "Dr. James Morrison is your biological father." The studio erupted in a mixture of gasps, tears, and spontaneous applause. Sarah collapsed into her mother's arms, finally having the answer she'd searched for her entire adult life. Michael reached out tentatively to his half-sister, and their embrace was the most genuine moment of connection anyone in that studio had ever witnessed. But Dr. Phil wasn't finished. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his other pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "James, Margaret told our producers that you gave her something before you left Portland. Something she's kept for 40 years. Margaret nodded through her tears. "A promise ring. You said it was temporary until you could afford something better." Dr. Phil opened the box, revealing a simple silver band. "She never took it off, James. 40 years, and she never took it off." The weight of Margaret's faithfulness, her enduring love despite his abandonment, finally broke James completely. He fell to his knees in front of her, sobbing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was a coward, and I ruined everything." Margaret knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands. "You gave me the greatest gift of my life," she said, looking at Sarah. "You gave me her." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dr. Phil called for a full production halt. What followed was 90 minutes of off-camera counseling, with Dr. Phil, his therapeutic team, and both families working through 4 decades of pain, abandonment, and misunderstanding. Linda Morrison, devastated by the revelation that her marriage was built on a lie and that Michael wasn't her husband's biological son, needed immediate support. Dr. Phil arranged for private counseling and gave her space to process the betrayal. Michael and Sarah, meanwhile, began the tentative process of becoming siblings. They discovered they both became teachers, both loved hiking, and both had struggled with feelings of not quite fitting in their respective families. When filming resumed, Dr. Phil addressed the camera directly. "In 30 years of doing this show, I have never seen anything like what happened here today. This is why I believe that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than lies." He turned to James and Margaret. "You two have a lot of work to do. James, you abandoned the mother of your child and lied to your wife for 40 years. Margaret, you raised a daughter alone but never stopped loving the man who left you. Both of your families are forever changed by what happened here today." Dr. Phil pulled out a business card and handed it to James. "This is the number for the best family counselor I know. You're going to call her, all of you, and you're going to do the hard work of rebuilding trust and creating new relationships." Then he turned to Sarah and Michael. "And you too, you have the chance to build something beautiful out of this chaos. You're siblings. You share DNA, you share talents, and now you share the truth." The immediate aftermath of the revelation required careful handling. Dr. Phil personally escorted both families to separate consultation rooms, where his team of licensed therapists began emergency counseling sessions. The emotional overload was evident. Sarah was hyperventilating, Michael was in shock, Linda Morrison had locked herself in the bathroom, and James sat motionless, staring at the promise ring. "This is exactly why we have protocols," Dr. Phil told his producers. "But sometimes life doesn't follow our scripts." For the next 2 hours, while the studio audience waited, Dr. Phil moved between rooms like a conductor orchestrating the most complex emotional symphony of his career. With Margaret and Sarah, he focused on processing the validation of their 40-year search. "Sarah, you've been carrying questions about your identity your entire life," he said gently. "Today you got answers. But answers come with responsibility. The responsibility to decide what kind of relationship you want with James going forward." In the adjacent room, he worked with Michael to process the revelation that his lifelong suspicions about his paternity were correct, but that his newfound half-sister represented an unexpected gift. "Michael, you came here looking for truth about your family, and you found more family than you knew existed. The most delicate conversation was with James and Linda Morrison. Their 45-year marriage hung in the balance as decades of deception unraveled in real time. "James," Dr. Phil said, his voice firm but compassionate, "you made a choice 40 years ago that affected 5 lives, Margaret's, Sarah's, Linda's, Michael's, and your own. Today, you have the opportunity to make better choices." Linda's pain was raw and immediate. "How do I trust anything he's ever told me?" she sobbed. "How do I know there aren't other women, other children? How do I know anything about the man I've been married to for 45 years? Dr. Phil sat across from her, holding space for her anguish. "Linda, your pain is valid. Your anger is justified. And your husband has a lot of work to do to earn back your trust, if that's even possible. But right now, in this moment, you also have the opportunity to be part of something healing for Sarah and Michael." When they finally returned to the stage, the energy was different. The raw shock had been processed enough for productive conversation. Dr. Phil addressed the audience directly. "What you've witnessed today goes beyond our typical show format. This is real life happening in real time, and it's messy and painful and beautiful all at once." He turned to James, his tone serious but not condemning. "James, you've been given a gift today. The chance to meet the daughter you abandoned and to be honest with the wife you've deceived. But gifts come with responsibilities. What are you prepared to do with this opportunity?" James's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I want to establish a relationship with Sarah, if she'll have me. I want to support her children, my grandchildren, whom I've never met. And I want to do whatever it takes to help Linda heal from my betrayal." The conversation that followed was unlike anything ever captured on television, raw, authentic, and deeply human. Dr. Phil facilitated discussions about boundaries, expectations, and the slow process of building trust from nothing. 6 months later, Dr. Phil received a photo in the mail. It showed Margaret and Sarah at Michael's wedding, where Sarah served as his maid of honor. James had walked her down the aisle, not as a replacement for the father who'd raised her, but as the biological father who was finally ready to be present in her life. Linda Morrison had filed for divorce but was working through her pain with counseling. She'd also developed a close relationship with Sarah, finding in her the daughter she'd never had. In an unexpected turn, she'd become one of Sarah's strongest supporters, helping her navigate the complex emotions of meeting her biological father. The promise ring that Margaret had worn for 40 years now sat in a shadow box in Sarah's home, next to a new photo of her expanded family. It served as a reminder that love endures even when people fail, and that truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply buried. Dr. Phil kept that wedding photo on his desk as a reminder of why he does what he does. Sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we're brave enough to face the truth, no matter how much it hurts. Sometimes the most broken situations can become the most beautiful redemption stories. And sometimes, a simple DNA test can reunite families that were never really broken, just separated by fear, pride, and the weight of secrets that were too heavy for one person to carry alone.